What would a father say to his daughter if it were the last time they ever spoke? Words meant to protect, or words that would haunt forever? It was 2 a.m. in a dimly lit San Francisco hotel room. Victoria Jones sat on the edge of the bed, phone pressed tightly to her ear, her eyes red from hours of restless pacing. Outside, the city hummed quietly, oblivious to the storm unfolding inside these walls. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Somewhere on the other end of the line, Tommy Lee Jones' voice trembled just enough to hint at a truth no one else could know. He said, "I did what I had to do. You were never supposed to know." The words lingered. They weren't just cryptic. They were dangerous. They were a confession of something too big, too heavy, and far darker than anyone could imagine. Victoria had faced enough struggles in her short 25 years to fill an entire lifetime. Multiple arrests, public battles with substance abuse, a string of failed rehab attempts, and the relentless gaze of the media. She had tried, over and over again, to piece together her life, but each time, it seemed to shatter a little further. Her father's words were supposed to comfort her. They were meant to explain. Instead, they opened a door to a past she hadn't fully understood, a past tangled with secrets that perhaps should have stayed buried. Think about it for a second. A parent hiding something so massive that the final words they speak become a riddle, a puzzle the world can't stop dissecting. What could Tommy Lee Jones, a man known for his stoic presence on screen, possibly have been protecting? Was it something about her own life? Something he did? Or something no one, not even Victoria herself, was meant to uncover? Victoria had always lived in the shadows of Hollywood whispers. Growing up, she had glimpses of her father's world, the sets, the awards, the press smiling for the cameras. But behind the glamour was something else. A father who worked tirelessly, yes, but also a man who carried secrets he didn't share. And now, in this lonely hotel room, those secrets seemed to reach out, clawing their way into the final moments of a daughter's life. She remembered the call vividly. The way he paused before speaking. The way his voice softened, almost breaking. "I did what I had to do." What did that mean? Did it mean he had made a choice to protect her from something? Or had he chosen something else entirely? Each repetition of those words in her mind was a haunting echo. The city outside remained silent, but inside her room, the air was thick with questions. Victoria's life hadn't been easy, by any measure. From her teenage years, there were signs that something wasn't right. Run-ins with the law began as minor incidents, skipping school, small public disturbances, but escalated over time. She experimented with substances, seeking relief from the pressures she couldn't articulate, from the environment that demanded perfection while ignoring the cracks in her foundation. Every headline about her arrests felt like a judgment, a narrative imposed upon her before she could even speak. And yet, at the center of it all, her father remained a figure both comforting and mysterious. The irony was cruel. The public saw Tommy Lee Jones as the gruff, dependable figure from his films. But here was a man capable of holding a secret so immense that even his daughter, the person he presumably loved above all, could not fully grasp it. What could possibly justify such secrecy? Could one moment of protection truly warrant a lifetime of confusion and heartbreak? Think about your own life for a second. Imagine a moment when someone's words could change everything you knew about them, about yourself, about the choices that shaped your existence. That's what Victoria faced. And that's why this story matters, not just to her, not just to her father, but to anyone who has ever wondered what lies behind the facades people wear, what people hide when they think no one is watching, and what happens when those secrets finally emerge. We are about to journey through the life of Victoria Jones, tracing her struggles, her triumphs, and the mysterious, haunting final conversation with her father. Along the way, you will encounter moments of betrayal, heartbreak, and shocking revelations that blur the lines between love and deception, protection and secrecy. Now, before we go any further, consider this. In the moments leading up to a person's death, what do they reveal? Do they leave messages of closure, hints of regret, or warnings that the world is unprepared to hear? Tommy Lee Jones' final words to Victoria may seem simple, but they were layered with meaning, with consequence, and with shadows that stretched far beyond the reach of public knowledge. Victoria tried to understand. She thought back to childhood, to family dinners, to long conversations she barely remembered. Small things now took on new weight. The way her father avoided certain topics, the fleeting looks of concern he never explained, the moments that seemed mundane at the time but now felt like pieces of a puzzle that should have been obvious. And yet, nothing could have prepared her for that night. Nothing could have readied her for the weight of those words echoing in her mind. Every fiber of her being screamed for clarity, but clarity was elusive. Instead, there were whispers. Rumors circulating through friends, through the media, through anonymous insiders. Each theory added to the suspense. Each speculation made the world want to know the truth even more. It's here, in the intersection of private tragedy and public curiosity, that the story gains its real gravity. Because when a life is lived under scrutiny, when every misstep is amplified, when every struggle is recorded, it becomes not just a personal tragedy, but a societal lesson. Mental health, substance abuse, family secrets, these are not just tabloid fodder. They are the very real struggles of people whose lives we can only glimpse through the fragments left behind. Victoria's story is also a mirror. It forces us to question what we don't know about the people closest to us. What secrets are carried in silence? What truths are too painful, too complicated to reveal? And ultimately, what happens when those truths emerge in a moment that changes everything? What does it mean to grow up in the shadow of a name everyone knows? A father whose face is on posters, whose voice echoes across movie screens, while the world watches your every misstep. Victoria Jones learned that question the hard way. From the outside, it looked like privilege, fame, Hollywood connections, a life that most people dream of. From the inside, it was a labyrinth of pressure, expectation, and the constant struggle to figure out who she was outside of her father's fame. Her teenage years were marked by rebellion, not uncommon for someone her age, but amplified tenfold because the public noticed everything. Early arrests began almost as whispers in the background, a minor altercation at a party here, a noise complaint there. Friends described her as a whirlwind of energy, someone who laughed too loudly, cried too deeply, and never quite fit into the mold that society seemed to demand. But what nobody understood was the isolation that came with it. She wasn't just a teenager making mistakes. She was a teenager under a microscope, every misstep magnified, every rebellion recorded, every attempt at freedom scrutinized. Victoria tried to navigate her life through these pressures, but the weight of expectation was relentless. She experimented with substances, at first small things. Alcohol at parties, cigarettes in secret corners of Los Angeles backyards. But experimentation quickly became reliance. It wasn't just about rebellion anymore. It was about coping with a reality that refused to bend around her. Was it the isolation, the scrutiny, or the growing realization that she could never live up to the image people had of her father's daughter? Perhaps all of it. Think about that for a moment. Imagine every mistake you made being public, every misstep dissected by strangers, and every action interpreted as a reflection of your parents rather than yourself. That was Victoria's reality. How would you handle that pressure? Would you crumble, fight, or lose yourself in whatever you could to escape it? Her arrests started small, almost trivial in the eyes of the public, but they escalated quickly. A DUI here, a substance possession charge there, and with each arrest came more media attention, more whispers, more judgment. Victoria felt trapped in a cycle she couldn't escape. Rehab programs became a revolving door, brief periods of hope followed by devastating relapses. She wanted to believe she could reclaim control over her life, but every step forward seemed to be met with 2 steps back. And then there was the question of family. Tommy Lee Jones remained a presence in her life, but one that was often distant. The father she knew on the screen, the stoic man whose voice carried authority and reassurance, was not always the man who answered her calls. Some days he was absent, too busy, too preoccupied, or perhaps too burdened by secrets to offer the comfort she desperately needed. And yet, she still longed for his guidance. Even in her darkest moments, she craved a father who could anchor her, someone who could make sense of a world that felt increasingly chaotic. The media's intrusion didn't make things easier. Every arrest, every relapse, every minor scandal was broadcast and dissected. Friends whispered about what they saw online. Acquaintances asked questions Victoria wasn't ready to answer. And through it all, the public formed opinions. A troubled young woman, a celebrity child lost in her own world, a cautionary tale. But these people didn't see the truth. They didn't see the fear that gripped her at night, the shame that kept her awake, the longing for understanding that went unmet. By the time Victoria reached her early 20s, the trajectory of her life had already begun to take shape in ways she hadn't anticipated. Substance abuse had become a crutch she couldn't let go of. Legal troubles had built a dossier of public record that painted her as unstable, and the weight of public expectation was unrelenting. Each setback compounded the last, creating an almost impossible climb back to normalcy. And yet, even in the darkest moments, there were flashes of brilliance, of personality, of the person she might have been under different circumstances. Her friends described her as fiercely loyal, deeply compassionate, and unbelievably intelligent. She had a wit that could disarm strangers and a humor that could lift those around her even in the bleakest moments. But these qualities were often overshadowed by the headlines, drowned out by the narrative that the world wanted to impose. And that narrative left Victoria struggling not only against her own demons, but against the public perception of who she was supposed to be. Her relationships were complicated. Romantic entanglements often ended in heartbreak. Friendships were strained by jealousy or misunderstanding, and familial bonds were tested repeatedly. She wanted love, support, guidance, and validation. What she often received was scrutiny, judgment, and a sense that no matter what she did, it was never enough. Have you ever felt that way? Like the world is demanding perfection from someone who isn't ready to deliver it? That was Victoria's daily reality. And then came the rumors, insidious whispers about her past, speculations about her behavior, half-truths that spread like wildfire online. It's one thing to make mistakes. It's another to have those mistakes amplified, twisted, and weaponized against you. Every rumor chipped away at her sense of self. Every headline became a mirror reflecting a version of herself that she didn't recognize. And yet, the need for connection remained. The need for understanding, for compassion, for a lifeline from someone who truly knew her, was more urgent than ever. This is where the tension between public persona and private reality becomes unbearable. Victoria was not just the sum of her mistakes. She was a person grappling with pain, trauma, expectation, and love all at once. But the world, obsessed with celebrity, rarely allowed her the space to exist as a human being rather than a headline. And that isolation, that constant feeling of being misunderstood, created a fertile ground for the mental health struggles that would follow. As the years passed, the cycles of rehabilitation, relapse, public scrutiny, and private despair continued. Every attempt to rebuild herself felt undermined by the very world she inhabited. She wanted to trust, to rely on the people around her, to find guidance from her father, but trust was fragile. Betrayal had become a constant companion, whether in friendships, professional relationships, or the media's relentless eye. Each betrayal reinforced the belief that perhaps the only person she could rely on was herself, or, in the haunting moments of despair, the one person whose cryptic words would soon change everything, her father. By the time the infamous phone call happened, Victoria had already walked a long, treacherous path. She had tasted freedom and disappointment, hope and despair, love and rejection, all under the weight of public scrutiny and familial expectation. She had navigated a world that demanded she perform her grief, her recovery, her missteps, and her triumphs like a scripted role. And yet, beneath the public narrative, she carried scars invisible to everyone but herself. Her life was a mosaic of contradictions. A young woman capable of immense kindness, yet driven by impulses she couldn't always control. Intelligent, yet trapped by poor decisions. Loved, yet isolated. And above all, she lived with the haunting awareness that the answers she sought, about herself, about her father, about the mysteries embedded in her family, might never be fully revealed. And now, as we look back on Victoria's life, it becomes clear that every arrest, every struggle, every publicized failure was not just a standalone event. They were pieces of a much larger puzzle, a puzzle that, if completed, would reveal a truth so shocking it would force everyone who thought they knew her to reconsider everything. But the story of Victoria Jones is not just a tale of missteps or tragedy. It is a story of human complexity, of a life lived under pressure, of a person navigating forces far beyond her control, and of the cryptic, haunting words of a father who carried secrets that would ultimately define her final moments. What kind of man speaks in riddles to his own child? What kind of father leaves words that feel like both a warning and a confession? Tommy Lee Jones, the stoic figure known for his towering presence on screen and his gravelly voice that commands attention, was not easily understood. To millions, he was the hero, the tough guy, the man of few words whose every line carried weight. To Victoria, he was something far more complicated, someone whose silence often said more than his speech, whose actions were measured, and whose secrets were buried deep, sometimes too deep for even her to reach. Tommy's public persona could not have been more different from the private man his daughter knew. In interviews, he appeared composed, controlled, sometimes dryly humorous, always self-assured. Behind closed doors, however, he was a man wrestling with decisions and memories he could not easily share, choices that carried consequences reaching far beyond himself. Family insiders whispered of a protective instinct so intense it could border on obsession, a devotion to his children that often collided with the realities of fame and secrecy. And yet, even this protection came with a price Victoria would only begin to comprehend in the last months of her life. Consider the paradox: a father whose love is immense, but whose methods are opaque, who walks a fine line between shielding and isolating. Tommy's history was layered with complexities. Decades of Hollywood fame, a demanding career, public scrutiny, and personal loss. Each element shaped him, sharpened him, hardened him in ways that left some questions permanently unanswered. And when it came to Victoria, those unanswered questions became a silent force that influenced her decisions, her struggles, and ultimately, her fate. Victoria grew up seeing him through the lens of admiration and awe. She watched his performances, studied his interviews, and absorbed the public image of her father, a man whose life seemed enviably controlled. But private glimpses told a different story. A phone call cut short, a sigh heavy with unspoken weight, a glance that lingered too long and conveyed far more than words ever could. Those moments hinted at a complexity that few outside the family could appreciate. Did he ever underestimate the impact his silence could have on her? Did he realize how his secrets, no matter how well-intended, might shape the path of her life? The pressures Tommy faced were not trivial. Every action, every public statement, was scrutinized. Every relationship, personal or professional, had to be managed with precision. The media was relentless, gossip pervasive, and fans and critics alike expected him to maintain a persona that was larger than life. In this world, privacy was nearly impossible, and yet, he carried his daughter's struggles in silence, shielding her from parts of reality he believed she wasn't ready to face. But was this protection or avoidance? And at what cost? There were whispers, too, from those close to the family. Friends described Tommy as a man of deep principle, someone who often bore burdens privately, even at personal cost. He had made choices, some difficult, some morally ambiguous, that he never explained to Victoria. At the time, she accepted them as a given, a component of her father's stoicism. She didn't realize the full weight of those choices until the night of their final conversation. Think about the paradox this created for Victoria. She had a father who loved her, yes, but also one whose very love was sometimes expressed through omission, secrecy, and cryptic warnings. How does a child navigate that? How does a daughter trust guidance from a parent whose methods are shrouded in mystery, whose silence is as loud as his words? And yet, she tried. She reached out. She sought answers, and she clung to whatever fragments of understanding she could gather, often grasping at shadows. What made Tommy's role even more complicated was the intersection of Hollywood fame and family. In a world obsessed with celebrity, every misstep, every choice, every word could be amplified into an irreversible headline. This is the environment in which Victoria's struggles unfolded and where Tommy had to navigate not just his own life, but the life of his daughter under constant observation. Did he overcompensate? Did he protect her too much? Or did he leave gaps in understanding that would later haunt them both? These questions were not rhetorical. They were reality, lived and experienced with consequences that no script or storyline could adequately capture. Tommy's decisions, both public and private, created a tension that Victoria felt acutely. Family gatherings, for example, often carried undercurrents of unspoken rules and invisible pressures. Even casual conversations were weighed with intention, every word measured, every omission deliberate. Victoria's friends sometimes commented on it, sensing a strictness or intensity in the Jones family dynamic that they couldn't fully articulate. But what they couldn't see were the burdens Tommy carried in silence, the regrets, the fears, the knowledge that some truths, if revealed too soon, could be devastating. It was in these moments of quiet observation, watching her father navigate life with precision, that Victoria both admired and feared him. Admired because he had survived a life few could endure, maintained control in the face of scrutiny, and displayed a mastery over his public persona. Feared because those same qualities meant he was unknowable, a man whose secrets could shape her destiny without warning. How does a child reconcile love with fear? How does she reconcile guidance with mystery? And, most importantly, how does she interpret the words of a father whose life has been defined by control and restraint when those words come late, when clarity is a luxury she can no longer obtain? Over time, the tension built. Tommy's role as father and enigma became inseparable. The cryptic elements of his communication, once a curiosity, began to weigh heavily on Victoria's psyche. What was left unsaid seemed to grow in importance. Every pause, every indirect comment, every refusal to elaborate became a puzzle she couldn't solve. And the more she sought answers, the more the shadows of uncertainty deepened, leaving her vulnerable to the very pressures and temptations that had always surrounded her. Now imagine the magnitude of what she faced the night of that final phone call. Here was a father whose love and secrecy intersected in ways that could only be understood fully when the stakes were life-altering. And on the other end of that line, Victoria tried to piece together meaning from words that were intentionally opaque. What could he mean by, "I did what I had to do. You were never supposed to know"? Was it a warning, an apology, a confession, or all of the above? Even friends of the family were left speculating. Some believed Tommy had taken measures to protect Victoria from a scandal she didn't fully understand. Others suggested darker interpretations, actions taken decades earlier that had repercussions only now coming to light. The truth, as is often the case, was somewhere in between, layered, nuanced, and haunting. Tommy Lee Jones, in his role as both father and enigma, existed in a space where love, protection, secrecy, and guilt collided. And it was this collision that defined Victoria's final years, shaped her decisions, and ultimately framed the context for that phone call. Every choice he made, every secret he held, reverberated through her life in ways that would only become clear in hindsight. So when we ask ourselves what kind of father could leave a daughter with such haunting words, the answer is not simple. It's a man who loved deeply, who feared the consequences of revelation, and who carried a burden too heavy to share until the final moment. But in trying to shield her, did he inadvertently contribute to the very struggle he hoped to prevent? Did his silence protect or harm? And when a final conversation is all that remains, how do those words shape destiny? The enigma of Tommy Lee Jones is not just a story of a father. It's a story of human complexity, of choices made under pressure, and of the hidden forces that guide our lives in ways we may never fully understand. And as the layers of his life and Victoria's intersect, one thing becomes clear. The mysteries of that father-daughter relationship are only just beginning to unfold. What do you say to someone when words might be the last thing you ever share? What do you reveal when every revelation carries consequences too heavy to measure? At 2 a.m. on a cold San Francisco night, Victoria Jones held the phone in trembling hands, unaware that the conversation she was about to have with her father would haunt her forever. The line was quiet at first, the kind of silence that makes every heartbeat feel loud. And then his voice came, calm yet strained. "I did what I had to do. You were never supposed to know." Those words were deceptively simple. On the surface, they seemed like an ordinary admission. But every syllable carried weight, a hint of a truth too dangerous, too convoluted to fully understand. To Victoria, it was a puzzle. Was it an apology? A confession? A warning? Or all three? Each interpretation was frightening, because the reality, whatever it was hidden behind a wall of silence that her father had built over decades. Victoria had called him for guidance, for clarity, for some semblance of comfort in a world that had become increasingly chaotic. Her struggles with substance abuse, the relentless pressure of public scrutiny, and her own spiraling mental health had driven her to seek answers. But Tommy's response, cryptic and deliberate, did not give answers. Instead, it left questions, and questions can be far more dangerous than silence. Consider the scenario: a father's voice on the other end of the line, calm but urgent, carrying a message you are meant to decode without the context to understand it fully. Every word feels intentional, every pause deliberate. How do you process that? What do you cling to? What do you fear the most? Victoria felt all of it at once. Her mind raced, trying to dissect meaning, to find the truth hidden in his tone, in his hesitations, in the carefully chosen words. I did what I had to do. What did that mean? Was it protection from the consequences of a past mistake? Was it a measure taken to shield her from someone else? Or was it something more personal, a secret that could fracture the very foundation of her understanding of family and trust? The ambiguity gnawed at her, a slow, persistent ache she couldn't escape. Friends and acquaintances would later speculate endlessly. Some thought it referenced the legal troubles she had faced, the arrests, the rehab stints, the moments where her life seemed to teeter on the edge of control. Others believed it hinted at something much older, a decision made years before, whose ripples were only now coming to light. Each theory was plausible. Each theory terrified her in its own way. Victoria's attempts to gain clarity were met with the kind of silence that comes from someone who has learned the art of concealment. Tommy Lee Jones, despite being a public figure, had always been private to an extreme degree. He was a man who measured his words carefully, who understood that revelation could have consequences far beyond immediate comprehension. But even for someone trained in discretion, choosing what to say to a child in crisis is a treacherous path. Say too much, and you risk exposing truths too dangerous to confront. Say too little, and you leave them adrift in a sea of uncertainty. This is what Victoria faced on that night. She needed guidance, yet the guidance was hidden within the very words that left her questioning everything. You were never supposed to know. That line carried finality, a quiet gravity that implied hidden knowledge, a forbidden truth that was now thrust into her consciousness, whether she wanted it or not. It was a line that fractured her reality, forcing her to grapple with the possibility that her understanding of her life, her father, and even herself might have been incomplete, if not fundamentally flawed. And then there was the timing. Why that night? Why that hour? The world outside was asleep, unaware of the drama unfolding in a single hotel room. The city lights reflected in the windows like silent witnesses, but they couldn't intervene. No one could. And in that isolation, the words carried even more weight, echoing through the room, embedding themselves in Victoria's mind. Every syllable was magnified. Every pause stretched into eternity. Every intonation became a clue she desperately tried to decipher. Victoria asked questions. What do you mean? Why now? Why didn't you tell me before? But the answers, when they came, were elusive. Hints dropped like breadcrumbs, leading her through a maze of half-truths and omissions. Her father's voice, calm yet heavy with emotion, suggested both remorse and necessity. The tone implied that his actions, whatever they were, had been unavoidable, and yet they came with consequences he could not undo. And what about the secrets themselves? Could they be about her past, or something that had affected him? Perhaps a mistake he had made in an attempt to protect her? Or something darker still, buried in layers of decision and consequence that only he fully understood? The possibilities swirled like a storm in her mind. Each hypothesis was more terrifying than the last. Each one demanded reckoning, and yet there was no opportunity to confront it fully. It's important to remember that Victoria was not unprepared for challenge. She had navigated crises before, battled addiction, and confronted public humiliation repeatedly. Yet, this moment was unlike any other. It was personal, intimate, and profoundly destabilizing. This was a father speaking to a daughter, not as a figure of authority, not as a celebrity, not as a man the world admired, but as a parent whose choices carried immense weight. And in that moment, Victoria realized the full gravity of their relationship, the intertwining of love, secrecy, and the complexity of human decisions. The conversation stretched, punctuated by long silences that were louder than words. Victoria tried to interpret the meaning behind each pause, each inflection, each subtle shift in tone. But some secrets resist decoding, especially when they are designed to protect, obscure, or shield someone from a truth they may not be ready to face. And this was exactly the kind of secret Tommy had spent a lifetime cultivating, a truth that would only emerge in fragments, leaving Victoria to assemble a picture from scattered, cryptic pieces. Meanwhile, outside the room, the world carried on, oblivious to the gravity of the exchange. News cycles, social media feeds, and the lives of strangers continued as if nothing had happened. But inside that room, reality had shifted. Victoria's understanding of her father, of their family, and of the events that had shaped her life was now in flux. Nothing would ever be the same again. What was Tommy trying to accomplish? Was this a moment of absolution, a plea for understanding, or a preemptive shield against consequences Victoria might face later? Every scenario was plausible, yet none were fully comforting. The ambiguity was unbearable, and yet it was all Victoria had. The clock ticked, and with each passing second, the weight of those words sank deeper into her psyche. And the impact of that conversation extended far beyond her own understanding. Those words, once spoken, could not be unspoken. They became a lens through which every action, every relationship, every past event had to be reconsidered. What had seemed mundane before, the silences, the absences, the unexplained decisions, now carried new significance. Everything was connected, every choice part of a chain reaction that led to this night, to this call, to this revelation. Victoria would later recount the conversation in fragmented memories, trying to piece together meaning from what had been said and what had been left unsaid. Each recollection revealed a layer of emotion. Fear, confusion, longing, and an undeniable sense that something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of her life and her father. Some secrets refused to stay buried. Some truths, no matter how carefully concealed, find a way to surface when the time is right. For Victoria Jones, the aftermath of that final phone call with her father became the beginning of a new, darker chapter. A chapter in which the shadows of past decisions, unspoken actions, and hidden motives began to reveal themselves in ways she could never have anticipated. What exactly was her father hiding? And why had he chosen now, at the very end, to speak in riddles that both protected and haunted her? These were questions that had haunted Victoria for years, and now, after hearing the cryptic words, the questions grew sharper, almost unbearable. The world outside may have assumed she was simply another troubled celebrity child, a young woman spiraling under pressure. But the truth was far more complex. Victoria began to dig deeper, trying to reconstruct events from her own memory and from accounts of those around her. She reached out to friends, longtime acquaintances, and even distant family members, hoping for clues, context, something to make sense of what had been said. And as she sifted through fragmented recollections, a pattern began to emerge. There were decisions, actions, and events that her father had orchestrated, carefully concealed, that intersected with her life in ways she hadn't realized. One of the first revelations was linked to her teenage years. Victoria had always wondered why certain incidents in her life had been handled with such precision, as if a force outside her understanding had been controlling outcomes. Minor arrests that could have escalated into major legal consequences were suddenly dismissed. Public incidents that should have attracted negative media attention seemed to fizzle out inexplicably. Friends had noticed, at the time, that her father's interventions were calculated, almost surgical. But now, with the memory of that phone call still echoing, Victoria began to piece together why these things had happened. He had been protecting her. And yet, in doing so, he had created a labyrinth of secrecy that made her question the truth behind every moment of her life. But protection came at a price. Each hidden intervention, each secret maneuver, was another thread in a tapestry of mystery that Victoria could no longer easily navigate. It was as if her life had been a carefully orchestrated performance, with her father both director and hidden hand, guiding events while never revealing the script. And the realization was both comforting and terrifying. She had been cared for, yes, but she had also been manipulated, shielded from truths that might have allowed her to make different choices, to understand her own life more fully. The more Victoria uncovered, the more contradictions emerged. Friends and acquaintances began to recount odd incidents, unexplained absences, strange phone calls, abrupt changes in plans. At the time, she had accepted them as random quirks or coincidences. Now, they appeared as deliberate interventions, carefully designed to keep her away from danger, or perhaps away from truths she wasn't ready to face. And the question that gnawed at her most relentlessly was this: had these interventions truly been for her benefit, or had they been for someone else's? Documents began to surface as well. Old emails, letters, and private communications that had been tucked away, hidden from the public eye. Each contained a fragment of the story, a glimpse into the motives and reasoning of a father whose life had always been private. Some were mundane, offering little insight beyond routine matters, but others were startling. There were references to decisions made decades earlier, choices involving other people, past incidents, and events that had been carefully orchestrated to maintain control over outcomes. The level of foresight and secrecy was staggering, almost overwhelming in its complexity. Victoria discovered that some of these secrets involved people she had trusted, or thought she could trust. Friends, acquaintances, and even professionals in her life had been brought in, knowingly or unknowingly, to assist in her father's efforts to control situations. Sometimes the interventions had been benevolent. A rehab program arranged, a legal situation mitigated, a public incident quietly contained. Other times, the interventions had been more morally ambiguous, decisions that involved deception, manipulation, or even withholding information that might have allowed her to make different choices. And the realization cut deeper than any public scandal ever could. Her own life had been partially curated, guided by hands that she had loved but also could not fully understand. Think about the emotional weight of this revelation. Imagine discovering that your life, your decisions, your sense of freedom had been shaped behind the scenes in ways you had not anticipated. Every choice you believed was your own suddenly becomes part of a larger, hidden design. For Victoria, the impact was devastating. She felt a mixture of gratitude, betrayal, and confusion, emotions so entangled they were almost impossible to separate. And yet, despite the shock, there was clarity emerging from the chaos. Pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. Incidents that had once seemed random now made sense. Her father's silence in critical moments, once frustrating and alienating, became an indicator of his hidden involvement. His cryptic phone call, now viewed in the context of decades of secrecy, was no longer merely a warning. It was a bridge, a final attempt to communicate truths he could never fully reveal while she still had time to hear them. Even so, not all secrets were benign. As Victoria dug deeper, she encountered decisions and actions that raised uncomfortable questions about morality, responsibility, and intent. Some interventions, while protective on the surface, had caused collateral consequences that no one could have predicted. Relationships had been strained, opportunities lost, and choices made under duress or misinformation had shifted the course of her life in profound ways. She began to understand that every act of protection carried a cost that she was now forced to reckon with. Surprising facts continued to emerge. People who had once seemed peripheral to her story, old friends, distant relatives, former professionals, now became central figures in the unfolding narrative. Each had knowledge of incidents that intersected with her father's secretive decisions. Some had been complicit, others unaware, but all contributed pieces to a puzzle Victoria had been piecing together her entire life. And with each revelation, the clarity she sought also deepened her confusion. How much of her life had been her own, and how much had been guided, intentionally or not, by her father's careful, enigmatic hand? The contradictions were particularly hard to bear. Tommy Lee Jones, the man who had been a source of security and authority, was also a man whose choices had sometimes left her vulnerable, uncertain, and questioning her own judgment. Gratitude and resentment collided in her mind as she sifted through the layers of secrecy. Could love and deception coexist? Could protection and manipulation exist side by side? And when the truth finally emerged, would it offer the closure she craved, or simply another layer of complication? Victoria's journey through the hidden secrets of her father's life revealed not just his complexity, but also the intensity of their bond. Every intervention, every withheld fact, every cryptic action had been motivated by a mixture of love, fear, and human imperfection. It became clear that while Tommy had tried to shield her from certain truths, the ultimate cost of secrecy was a legacy of confusion, curiosity, and emotional struggle that Victoria would carry to her final moments. And yet, even in the midst of unraveling these secrets, a greater question loomed. Were all the answers hidden, or was there still a final truth waiting to be uncovered? The deeper Victoria delved, the more she realized that some revelations were not yet ready to be faced. The phone call, the last words of her father, had unlocked a doorway, but behind it lay corridors of history, decision, and consequence she had only begun to explore. What she found was both illuminating and frightening. The past was not static. Every secret, every decision, every concealed action shaped the present. And the culmination of these hidden truths was about to reach a point where the boundaries between protection, control, and unintended harm would blur, leaving Victoria and the world staggered by the implications. Before the headlines, before the arrests, before the fateful phone call, there was a past that no one spoke about. A past that shaped both Victoria and her father in ways they could never escape. To understand the weight of that final conversation, you have to understand the shadows that lingered behind the Jones family's life. Shadows that stretched back decades, quietly influencing decisions, relationships, and the trajectory of Victoria's life. Victoria had always sensed something unspoken. Family stories were carefully curated, old incidents glossed over or vaguely described. Certain relatives were never mentioned. Conversations ended abruptly, and questions she asked about her childhood were met with sighs or evasive answers. Children are perceptive. Even without understanding the full scope, Victoria felt that there was more to her father's life, and by extension, her own, than she was being told. Some of the earliest incidents were almost invisible at the time. A canceled birthday party here, a sudden change in plans there, arguments that seemed to disappear without resolution. These moments seemed inconsequential, but they were pieces of a larger pattern, fragments of a story that only became clear years later. And when combined with her father's cryptic phone call, these fragments took on a chilling significance. There were rumors, too, whispered among distant family friends and Hollywood insiders, about events that occurred long before Victoria was old enough to remember. Some were mundane, financial decisions, career moves, but others hinted at turmoil and secrecy. Tommy had made choices that impacted not just himself, but those closest to him, in ways that remained hidden from the public eye. And these choices, while not inherently sinister, carried consequences that Victoria would later realize shaped her life profoundly. The most significant element of the dark past involved a mixture of personal trauma and carefully concealed decisions. There were incidents from Victoria's early childhood, conflicts, misunderstandings, and exposures to adult challenges that she had only dimly remembered. These events were complicated by Tommy's desire to shield her, to protect her from harsh realities he believed she was too young to face. But in protecting her, he also created gaps in her understanding, leaving her to interpret events with incomplete information, a dangerous combination for a child navigating a complex world. Imagine growing up with protective barriers in place, only to realize later that those barriers shaped not just your perception, but also your reactions, your fears, and your choices. That is what Victoria faced. She had been partially insulated from certain truths, but the absence of knowledge was almost as potent as trauma itself. Every decision, every intervention, every hidden moment had consequences. And the closer she came to understanding the full picture, the more she realized how profoundly the past had sculpted her present. There were specific events that Victoria later discovered had been pivotal. Family disputes that had been downplayed, financial or legal incidents that had been quietly resolved, and personal choices that Tommy had made in secrecy, all of which were intended to protect her or the family's reputation. But each act of protection carried an emotional cost. The more Tommy shielded, the more Victoria was left grappling with gaps in her understanding. And when the final phone call arrived, the echoes of these past decisions were unavoidable. One particularly haunting revelation involved an incident from Victoria's adolescence. A legal situation that had the potential to spiral publicly was quietly contained, orchestrated in a way that shielded her from scrutiny. On the surface, it appeared as though she had navigated the situation independently. But in reality, her father had intervened behind the scenes. At the time, Victoria never knew. The secrecy, intended to protect, had instead instilled a sense of isolation and confusion, a feeling that the world she knew was not fully real, that there were invisible hands shaping outcomes without her understanding. And these weren't isolated incidents. They formed a pattern, a shadowed history that explained much of the uncertainty, anxiety, and internal conflict Victoria experienced throughout her life. The hidden interventions and carefully constructed protections were double-edged. On one side, they kept her from immediate harm. On the other, they prevented her from fully understanding the dynamics around her, leaving her vulnerable to choices and pressures she could not fully anticipate. As Victoria delved deeper, she began to connect the past to her father's cryptic words. "I did what I had to do." Those words now seemed rooted not in a single event, but in a lifetime of choices, sacrifices, and secrets. Decisions made decades before had culminated in the moment of that phone call, shaping not just her understanding of her father, but her understanding of herself. Every hidden truth, every protective measure, every unspoken choice intersected in ways that created a dense web of consequences she was only beginning to untangle. The emotional toll was immense. Gratitude battled with resentment. Love conflicted with confusion. Victoria had to reconcile the reality that her father's protective actions had been well-intentioned, yet the secrecy left her unprepared for the full consequences of her own life. And the irony was inescapable. The very protection meant to safeguard her had created a foundation of uncertainty, leading to questions that may never have answers. What made the dark past even more complex were the people intertwined in it. Extended family, family friends, mentors, and even some of Tommy's colleagues had been involved, knowingly or unknowingly, in events that shaped Victoria's life. Each participant added layers to the story, layers of intention, misunderstanding, and sometimes miscommunication. For Victoria, discovering these layers was both illuminating and deeply unsettling. It revealed a network of influence she had never fully appreciated, a network whose effects rippled across her life in ways she was only beginning to see. And yet, there was a perverse clarity in these revelations. Understanding the past allowed Victoria to contextualize her father's actions, his words, and his motivations. It shed light on the cryptic message he had delivered in that final call, offering a glimpse into the reasoning behind decisions that had seemed opaque, even incomprehensible. The dark past was not merely a source of trauma. It was a key to understanding the complexity of the man who had shaped her life so profoundly. The emotional stakes escalated as Victoria began to confront not just the events themselves, but the consequences they had wrought. She realized that her struggles with identity, trust, and self-understanding were deeply intertwined with a history she had only partially known. Every choice she made, every decision she had questioned, was now illuminated by the knowledge of hidden decisions, concealed truths, and protective actions she had only now begun to decode. And as the night stretched on, the weight of the past and the implications of her father's words pressed down on her. She understood now that her life, her struggles, and her fate were part of a larger narrative, one that combined love, protection, secrecy, and unintended consequences. The full picture was still incomplete, but every fragment revealed a complex web of cause and effect, intention and consequence, love and secrecy. Victoria's journey through the dark past was just beginning. She had uncovered only the first layer of hidden truths, and yet already it was enough to challenge everything she thought she knew. Every revelation demanded more questions. How far had the protective measures gone? What had been left out? And most importantly, what did all of this mean for the final conversation with her father? What happens when the pressure of fame, secrecy, and expectation becomes too much for one person to bear? For Victoria Jones, the answer came in cycles of rebellion, reliance, and despair. Her struggles with substances were not born from a single choice or moment. They were the accumulation of years of emotional turbulence, compounded by the complex web of secrecy surrounding her family and her father's protective, yet cryptic, interventions. Victoria's first brushes with substance use were subtle. At parties she attended during her late teens, she experimented with alcohol, seeking escape from a life that felt overwhelming and constricting. At first, it was innocent enough, a drink to fit in, a cigarette to feel older, a joint to experience something different. But each small step carried consequences she could not yet see, and each indulgence became a foothold for patterns that would follow her into adulthood. By the time she reached her early 20s, experimentation had escalated into reliance. Alcohol became a constant companion during moments of stress. Prescription medications provided temporary relief from anxiety. Illicit substances offered an illusion of control in a life where control often seemed elusive. Every relapse, every dependency, deepened the cycle, leaving her trapped in a rhythm she could neither predict nor break. And yet, the public perception was often cruelly simple. Headlines labeled her as a troubled celebrity child, a young woman spiraling out of control. Friends and acquaintances, both sympathetic and judgmental, struggled to reconcile the person they knew with the narrative projected in the media. But what the world rarely considered were the hidden pressures that influenced her behavior. The weight of expectation, the constant scrutiny, and the history of secrecy that had shaped her understanding of the world. Her arrests were a stark reflection of this struggle. Each incident seemed to confirm the public's assumptions, feeding a cycle of judgment and misunderstanding. There were DUIs, minor legal infractions, and public disturbances, each one magnified because of her name, her family, and the public's fascination with celebrity downfall. For Victoria, each arrest carried layers of shame, guilt, and frustration, not just at herself, but at the circumstances that had shaped her choices. The emotional impact of these arrests was profound. They were not isolated incidents. They were markers in a timeline of struggle, each one building upon the last. Friends described her as oscillating between hope and despair, moments of clarity followed by intense periods of self-doubt and relapse. And throughout it all, the influence of her father's decisions loomed in the background. Interventions that protected her legally or financially may have prevented immediate consequences, but they also prevented her from fully understanding the ramifications of her choices. Consider the psychology of this situation: a young woman struggling to find autonomy, navigating the intense pressures of fame, while her father's protective actions simultaneously shield and obscure. She wanted independence, yet the very structures meant to protect her constrained her understanding of freedom. Each intervention, though well-intentioned, added to the confusion, leaving her grappling with both gratitude and resentment. How do you reconcile love with control? Protection with restriction? Victoria wrestled with these questions daily, often in isolation, often under the harsh gaze of a world eager to judge her every move. Substance struggles, as Victoria experienced, are rarely linear. They are a series of peaks and valleys, moments of hope followed by relapses, clarity replaced by chaos. Friends recounted instances where she appeared resilient and focused, only to see her slip back into behaviors that seemed to erase all progress. The unpredictability of her actions mirrored the unpredictability of her emotions. One moment brimming with laughter, the next consumed by despair. It was exhausting for her, and it was exhausting for everyone around her. Yet, even in the midst of this turmoil, Victoria demonstrated remarkable strength. She sought help repeatedly, enrolled in rehab programs, participated in therapy sessions, and tried, over and over, to reclaim control over her life. Each attempt, even when followed by relapse, was a testament to her resilience. It's easy to look at her substance struggles and dismiss them as weakness or failure. But in truth, they were the manifestations of a person grappling with immense internal and external pressures, navigating a complex web of personal history public expectation, and family secrecy. The legal interventions her father orchestrated only complicated matters. Some arrests were minimized or quietly resolved, avoiding public escalation. While these actions prevented immediate legal consequences, they also contributed to a sense of disorientation for Victoria. She could not always differentiate between genuine accountability and a life buffered by protective hands she did not fully understand. And that ambiguity, while designed to shield her, added layers to the confusion she carried into adulthood. Public scrutiny amplified every misstep. Social media platforms exploded with speculation following every arrest, with commenters passing judgment without knowledge of the context. The media often presented her struggles in stark black and white terms, emphasizing scandal over understanding. For Victoria, this relentless attention compounded the emotional toll, leaving her feeling isolated and misunderstood, even by those who cared for her. How does someone maintain a sense of self when the world insists on defining them by their lowest moments? That was Victoria's daily reality. And then there were the personal betrayals, subtle but no less painful. Friends and acquaintances, navigating the treacherous waters of celebrity proximity, sometimes failed to support her genuinely. Some were enablers, others were critics disguised as confidants. The line between loyalty and exploitation blurred, leaving Victoria to question whom she could trust and intensifying the isolation she felt. Each incident, each relapse, each arrest became a lens through which she was forced to examine the complicated interplay of family, secrecy, and personal choice. Her substance struggles were not merely about escapism. They were symptomatic of deeper wounds, mental health challenges, unresolved trauma, and the weight of secrets her father had kept. Every dependency, every lapse, every moment of self-destruction was both a cry for help and a manifestation of the environment she had been navigating for years. And the irony was cruel. The very protections that might have mitigated one set of dangers introduced another set, leaving her in a cycle she could neither fully control nor escape. Friends would later recall moments where Victoria appeared both remarkably self-aware and tragically lost. She understood, intellectually, the consequences of her actions. She saw the patterns, recognized the triggers, and attempted interventions. But the emotional and psychological pressure, compounded by secrecy and public scrutiny, was immense. It is one thing to understand the problem. It is another to escape it when the world watches your every misstep. And yet, even amidst these struggles, there were moments of clarity. Moments when Victoria glimpsed the life she wanted, the person she could become. She made plans, attempted rehabilitation, reached out for support, and tried to navigate her own autonomy. But each step forward was precarious, often threatened by past patterns, public perception, and the complex legacy of family secrets. By the time the final phone call arrived, Victoria had already endured years of legal, emotional, and psychological battles. She had fought, stumbled, and fought again. She had been judged, misunderstood, and occasionally protected in ways that both saved her and complicated her understanding of herself. And when her father spoke those words, "I did what I had to do. You were never supposed to know," they resonated not only with the weight of secrecy, but also with the context of her ongoing struggles. The arrests, the substance use, the cycles of relapse and recovery. All of these were threads in the tapestry of a life shaped by both choice and circumstance, by personal struggles and family secrets. The phone call illuminated a larger picture. Her father had been navigating not just the world outside, but also the private complexities of her life, attempting to guide, shield, and sometimes control outcomes in ways she would only later fully comprehend. And as Victoria grappled with the implications of that call, she realized that the final layer of her struggle was not the substance abuse itself. It was understanding the deeper forces behind it, the hidden actions, the secret decisions, and the unspoken intentions that had influenced her life from the beginning. What does it feel like to live in a world where everyone is watching, analyzing, and judging your every move? For Victoria Jones, the pressures of Hollywood were not a distant backdrop. They were a relentless force shaping her life, her decisions, and even her sense of self. From an early age, she existed in a bubble where fame, expectation, and secrecy collided, creating an environment that was simultaneously glamorous and suffocating. Victoria's childhood and adolescence were defined by contrasts. On one hand, she had access to the privileges of her father's fame, invitations to events, glimpses of red carpets, exposure to a world most people only dream about. On the other hand, every privilege carried scrutiny. A casual social media post could ignite rumors. A minor infraction could become a headline. Every choice she made, from what she wore to where she went, was magnified under the unblinking eye of public fascination. The isolation she experienced in this environment was profound. Friends and acquaintances often seemed like allies, but in a world that thrives on gossip and intrigue, trust was a fragile commodity. Relationships were complicated by fame. People who were once close could quickly become distant, whether due to jealousy, pressure, or the constant glare of the media. Victoria felt this acutely. Even when surrounded by people, she often felt profoundly alone, navigating a landscape that was more performative than personal. This pressure compounded her existing struggles with mental health and substance use. The external world demanded perfection, while the internal world was turbulent. Victoria's attempts to reconcile these two realities were ongoing and exhausting. Every moment of vulnerability risked exposure. Every public misstep could be exploited.